Hey, I'm Jenna Wolf, certified lactation counselor, parent coach, and extended breastfeeding mom of two. I fully understand the unique challenges of breastfeeding beyond the baby days, and I'm here to take your hand and support you along your journey. So toss that hair in a messy bun, grab a basket of laundry to fold, and let's get started. This is Start to Stop Toddler Breastfeeding. The third and final part of the Gentle Toddler Weaning Series is here. So, just to recap, in the previous two episodes, we began our journey with understanding how to begin weaning from breastfeeding. And in that episode, I talked about the most common ways to, quote, begin weaning. And we've talked about things like drop one feed at a time, or don't offer, don't refuse, or swap for snacks, and how all of those different approaches miss the mark. They, to recap it all in one, neat little sentence, is they miss the underlying needs that are driving the breastfeeding experience and the breastfeeding relationship up to this point. So instead of giving you a really practical tip of like, this is how you begin, this is your tip or trick for how to begin weaning, I encouraged you to start with your why for weaning. And I gave you some journal prompts to do that. And then in the next episode, I kind of worked backwards and I started with, are you ready to wean? How do you know that you and your child are ready to wean? And in this one, I really flipped the script, right? I suggested that you actually are already weaning and that weaning begins much earlier on in the breastfeeding relationship than most people realize. And instead of directly answering the question of like, how do you know if you're ready to wean? What I encourage you to do is identify the source of your discomfort, right? Because breastfeeding is going to serve you and your child for as long as it is being given, as far as nutritional support and immunological support and disease prevention and emotional connection and nervous system regulation and all of those pieces. So weaning, like fully stopping from breastfeeding, it's going to happen whether you're intentional about it or not, right? So it's not something that you need to always decide to do. It's not always intentional in that way. And I worked through whether, mother-led weaning or child-led weaning, if those things are real. And I talked about all those things. So go back and listen to that episode if you're interested. But what I left you with was identify the source of your discomfort. So there's a reason why you're wrestling with this. There's a reason why things feel tough right now, because you actually likely, if you're not in that early ecological breastfeeding phase where your child is having no pacifier, no schedule, no bottles, and is with you basically 24/7 breastfeeding to respond to every cue that they're giving. If you're not in that phase anymore, then you already are weaning. So weaning's not working for you. This process isn't working for you. You're experiencing some discomfort, whether it's just mentally or in your day or you're exhausted, whatever that is, something's happening. So I encouraged you to identify that source of discomfort. Okay, so what is actually going on here? What is the root of my discomfort? Because if you're making changes to your breastfeeding rhythm, to your breastfeeding relationship, and you're not identifying that root source of discomfort, it's going to pop up in other areas, whether you're aware of it or not. Right? Okay. So that was what I encouraged you to do. That's kind of the recap of the previous couple episodes. So now we're assuming that, yes, you're like, I think I need to make some changes, or I know I'm going to need to make some changes soon, or you're ready to fully stop breastfeeding. And you want to know how to do that. And I get it. That's what I'm here for. I got you. So first off, let's talk about the 5 different types of like, quote, weaning, right? I already suggested that we're already weaning, but I know that that's the language that we all use. Like I've said a million times before, language when it comes to extended breastfeeding or full-term breastfeeding is really tricky, right? So let's talk about the 5 different ways that people think about changing or weaning in their breastfeeding relationship. So the first one would be night weaning, right? That comes up all the time. And, we all understand that essentially means to cut out feeds from a certain point in the evening to a certain point in the morning. For some people, this does mean stopping breastfeeding to sleep, for the first falling asleep. And for other people, it doesn't. So, again, terminology, it can mean a few things. And there's lots of different methods for night weaning out there. You can look at Dr. Jay Gordon. I know that that's a really popular one. There are other methods. There's books on it. You can hire sleep coaches to help you with night weaning. There's all of these things. So that's one method of weaning, or one type of weaning. And then we have day weaning. So day weaning is, essentially the opposite, but this is really common when kids are starting school or parents are going back to work. And depending on where you are in the world, that could be at 1 year or 18 months or 2 years, or unfortunately, much, much earlier if you're in the US or other countries. I'm not sure every single maternity leave situation around the world, but that can, a lot of times day weaning happens when parents are going back to work. And then we can look at our boundaries, right? A lot of times it's like you're either weaning or you're creating boundaries. So I love to talk about boundaries. I love, love, love it. But I think that we look at boundaries the wrong way. We look at boundaries as saying like no to certain feeds during the day. But I take a much more holistic view of boundaries. That being said, I know that this is kind of like a type of weaning. This is a type of change that people make in their breastfeeding experience. And a lot of times, boundaries are actually implemented so that you can keep breastfeeding, right? Because I can't keep going on like this. So something needs to change so that I can keep going. Right. So it's kind of a way of weaning, but also a way of continuing. I talked in that last episode, I think, about, adding dominoes to the end of you kind of that first domino tips when you first introduce the pacifier or the bottle or the schedule or the solid foods, that first kind of domino tips, and then you begin this weaning process. And it can take months, years, right, to get through that. And sometimes you're like, okay, this end is nearing. But for whatever reason, and there's plenty of valid ones, you want to continue on. You're not ready to fully stop. So you can add dominoes to kind of the end of your, chain here, right? To keep that path going, but in a way that feels really good for you and your child, right? So that could look like boundaries. Which may just mean certain feeds during the day or certain types of breastfeeding or whatever that you're making changes to. So it's kind of like the catch-all for it's day weaning, it's not night weaning, but we're making some changes. Okay, so we have that. And then there is full weaning, which I'm going to hopefully from now on just call stopping, right? Because it gets confusing. We're always weaning, you're never weaning. Whoa, what's happening, right? So when I'm talking about full weaning, I'm talking about stopping breastfeeding completely. So this is when you fully removed breastfeeding from your relationship with your child. So that's a type of weaning that can happen, right? And then this one isn't necessarily a type of weaning, but it's definitely a big change that happens, and that would be tandem feeding. So this could be breastfeeding through pregnancy, or the baby is born and here, and now you're breastfeeding two kiddos. And then you might have any of those previous four kind of fall into that, right? That you're making these changes for the tandem feeding. But tandem feeding inherently is going to change your breastfeeding relationship. And when you're breastfeeding through pregnancy, it's possible you may dry up. It's possible the flavor of your milk could change and your child may no longer want to feed. So that could result in some weaning happening all on its own. Without any particular effort from you, right? So that's definitely a type that can fall into there. All right. So what is the trouble with this kind of lens of these categories of weaning, right? I know I don't do things the conventional way, so I'm going to flip it all on you again. So when we're looking at these things, the categories that we've set are actually all about the outside behavior. Right? So each of these sections, night weaning, day weaning, boundaries, full weaning, tandem feeding, it's all about what's happening on the outside, how the actual day and the physical act of breastfeeding is unfolding or not. Here's the trouble. When you want to pick a type of weaning and you're like, I'm going to start with night weaning or I'm going to start with day weaning, what you're actually picking is just a block of time during the day. It's missing the needs underneath, right? You're going to come up against resistance. It's going to be a struggle if you're like, I'm going to pick night weaning, or I'm going to pick day weaning, or I'm going to pick boundaries, right? You're not necessarily getting to that root of the discomfort. And I hear you right now. You're like, I came into this episode because I want or I need to wean, Jenna. Whoa, what are you? This is not helpful. And I get it. I get it. Here's the trouble though. If you are viewing breastfeeding as just a habit that needs to be broken, right? It's just a habit that needs to be broken, then pushing through the resistance that may come up makes sense, right? It's like you're just waiting for the better days that are going to come on the other side once we break this habit. And so it makes sense to view breastfeeding in this kind of behavioral lens and to just be like, okay, we're just going to pick our time that we're weaning and we're just going to push through it. And it's all just going to be better on the other side. And that makes sense if you're seeing breastfeeding as simply a behavior. It's just an action. It's just kind of this remnant of this experience from it was necessary, before they turned a year or before they turned 6 months or whatever, but it's not anymore. So this is just this leftover remnant behavior, this physical act that's just kind of there, and we just need to eliminate it, right? And I think even if you believe that breastfeeding is beneficial beyond a year or beyond 2 years or whatever, it's easy to still have that kind of lingering ideology and viewpoint philosophy around breastfeeding because that's the world's view. That's the way that people view it in our culture. But, and I've talked about this many, many times, if you believe and if you see that it is breastfeeding is an effective way of your child getting their needs met, then pushing through the change of breastfeeding, think about this, right? Makes sense if it's a habit to be broken, then pushing through means you just have to push through until that habit is broken and then everything's going to get better. But if that breastfeeding is a way of getting their needs met and you're just pushing through, what's going to happen? Right? And even in that, when we're talking about it, in the viewpoint of a habit, it's this kind of remnant from their younger days, and we just kind of have to break it and get over it. You can also think about it in this way of getting a need met, that it's their oldest way of getting their needs met, right? So developmentally speaking, they're going to be adding layers, new skills onto getting their needs met, right? But it means that when they're really stressed out, they might lose access to some of those new skills. So what's going to be the primary way that they're going to often move to get their needs met when they're stressed out? Right? So when they're losing access, when things are happening and they're struggling, instead of being like, oh yeah, I have this new skill, I'm going to try and use it, I'm going to think this through. No, instead they kind of go into like a survival mode. They quote regress, but they go back to that primary way that they've just been doing since they were, literally born, like quite literally born. So when you view it in that way, as this effective tool, effective pathway to get their needs met, then pushing through the change is going to result in some difficult, have some difficult effects, have some difficult results. So there's basically 3 different things that I think will happen, that I see happen when we just try to push through the changes and get to the other side, right? So you have this idea of like, oh, it's just a habit that needs to be broken, we're going to push through. But that's not actually true. That's not really reality, right? Your child is actually getting their needs met through it. So what's happening? Those needs go unmet. So depending on your child's temperament, they may have a few different responses to those unmet needs. They might get really aggressive and bullish about breastfeeding. So that means they're going to put up a ton of resistance, and you're going to have the fireworks and the drama and the thunder and the lightning and all the things happening, right? Your child's basically going to be like, no way, I need this, I'm going to keep doing it, right? And the more stressed they get, the less access they have to all of those other skills that they've been learning and growing with, right? And so they're going to even want that breastfeeding even more because they're going to have these needs and they're going to try to get it. So if your child's temperament falls in that kind of category where they might have that kind of response, that's going to happen. Then there's another way that things can fall depending on their temperament. So they'll either have those unmet needs, they'll just be like, I need this. And of course, this is unconscious, right? Like they're just reacting. It's just like a reaction, a response that they don't have much control over, especially under, age 5 or so. They really have like no impulse control. So it's just going to happen. And then, so if they either get bullish and aggressive, or they're going to have those needs kind of go a little bit underground, but they're going to pop up in other ways. And a lot of times parents don't even realize that this is happening. So they're just going to be really confused. Like, why is my child suddenly having such a hard time at daycare drop off? Right? Why are they biting kids at daycare? Or maybe it's going to be more sibling issues. They're like, okay, the kids are fighting a lot right now. Or maybe it's going to be more night waking or other strange behaviors. And yes, sometimes they get really strange and weird. They pop up in strange ways. I can go into tons of details about this, and I'm sure I will. Maybe I'll do a whole episode just on the strange things that can happen when our kids' needs go unmet. But again, it's likely, especially if you have this kind of lens that breastfeeding is the source of your discomfort, or that breastfeeding was just a habit, you're not going to make that connection that it has to do with breastfeeding stopping, right? And so you're going to be trying to fix this in other ways, and you're not going to see those unmet needs underneath, right? Okay, so the first way, your child could get really aggressive. Or the second way would be that your child has these needs pop up in other ways. It's called a miscue too. Like, this is a real thing. Then the third way is a way that's really sneaky. And this would be when those needs get pushed so far underground, those needs just go unmet. And this, again, depends on your child's temperament. It depends on other factors, but they might just accept that those needs just won't be met. And that's really honestly quite sad. Now, from the outside, this can just look like compliance. It's like, oh yeah, we weaned and it was no big deal. But it's like, what's actually happening is that your child is so deeply in survival mode that they just detach from their own needs in order to survive. And we know that kids will put their own needs aside to please their caregivers at as young as 11 months old. Now, there are ways to move out of all of those things, right? Nothing is written in stone. So if you've experienced these things, if you're like, oh no, something like these things are happening, I don't know what's happened, don't worry, I got you. Okay, this is not the end. There's so much hope. We can move through these things. There's ways to support yourself. There's ways to support your child. But I just want to be honest with you that your child's needs are important, right? And that the development that's happening in their brain right now through these early years will set them up for the rest of their lives. How they're going to relate to other people, how they're going to relate to other intimate relationships. So their partners, their close friends, and as well their own children. We know that these are templates. These are kind of programs and roadmaps that are being kind of like embedded, formed in your child's mind right now. So it's going to serve them for a long time. Now, these things can change. Don't get me wrong. There's hope, but it still is important. Okay. So how can you avoid those reactions happening, right? What do you need to do to make things better for yourself and your child? Stop suffering, right? You're experiencing discomfort. If this was all easy breezy, you wouldn't have even tuned into the podcast, right? Like, no, I got this. But so what can you do to avoid your child either getting explosive or having all of these kind of weird behaviors pop up, or having their needs go so far underground that they just kind of detach from them? I'm going to give you kind of these 4 phases, or this 4-step plan to what I call owning your breastfeeding story. So that is the name of my course. And I absolutely support you to move through these pieces in that course. But I called it Owning Your Breastfeeding Story because you can be in control. This doesn't have to feel like it's happening to you, right? Or like these side effects and these reactions from your child are just, going to happen. You can own this story. You can own the way that it's going to unfold in front of you. You can take control and have agency in this process. It doesn't just have to happen. You don't need to be a victim to it all, right? So there's 4 phases that I work with my clients through one-on-one, and I work with you through in the course, but I'm going to walk through them now. So the very first one is to identify the needs. right? Sounds obvious. I know I talk about needs, 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 needs. But identify the needs for both you and your child, right? Now, I want to be really clear that your needs matter here. In fact, the discomfort that you're experiencing is because of your own unmet needs. Okay? I don't know if that's going to land, but that discomfort inside of you it doesn't belong to your child. It belongs to you. So that means that there's things happening inside of you or around you that are about you and not about your child. So the very fact that you are experiencing discomfort means that you need to be served as well, that your needs matter and that we need to support you or you need to support you, right? And your child, right? So we're going to look at your needs and your child's needs. Now, what are those needs? There's emotional needs, there's attachment needs, there's nutritional needs, there's sensory needs, and there's even some developmental needs that can all play a role in the needs that are kind of driving the cycle in your relationship or this, this breastfeeding stress cycle I talk about, as well as your child's need to feed and your own responses to your child's need to feed, right? So you have all of these different layers there. So emotional safety is important. I'm going to get into that a little bit more, but nutritional, and nutritional has a lot of pieces. Yes, there's the actual physical act of eating food, but even your relationship to food is really important and is a need that needs to be supported. Then there's sensory. So your sensory input, the physical touch, the smells, all of those things are regulating your nervous system. And it's really important for you and your child that those are met adequately. Then there's attachment. So like the way that you're relating to other people in your life and your sense of security in those relationships, right? That's an important need that needs to be met as well. Okay, so once you've identified these needs that are at play, then you need to preemptively meet those needs to take the pressure off of breastfeeding. So I talked about how breastfeeding is this kind of primary method that your child uses to get their needs met. And in the moment when your child is using breastfeeding to get those needs met, it's difficult to switch gears and use a different method to get those needs met. So this looks like adjustments to your daily and weekly rhythm, your lifestyle, even the way your home is set up, your relationships with other people. All of those things get tweaked and adjusted and kind of optimized so that those needs are being met very organically and kind of naturally in your lifestyle, which takes the pressure off of breastfeeding. So breastfeeding becomes less of this mental load pile in your brain. It's less of this struggle. It's not something you're thinking about all the time. You can leave your child with other caregivers without thinking about breastfeeding or worrying about breastfeeding because those needs are being met. Breastfeeding is just like a fun, natural part of your relationship that serves a beautiful purpose, but is not stressful for you. Right? So if you are preemptively meeting those needs and the discomfort eases and everything gets easier, then you can stop here. You do not need to stop breastfeeding altogether. You don't even need to make intentional changes to your breastfeeding rhythm. If taking the pressure off of breastfeeding works, mwah, beautiful, chef's kiss. That's all you need, right? But I do find that this is actually one of, or perhaps the hardest phase or the hardest step. And the reason is that you've probably been avoiding making the changes to your lifestyle, to your daily and weekly rhythm, to your home, and all of those things because they feel really overwhelming. And there's a lot of stuff that gets stirred up, right? There's probably a reason that you haven't been taking care of yourself very well. And there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of beliefs that maybe you're not good enough, right? Or that you're powerless or whatever is coming up. And those things can be very unconscious and kind of steering and driving the car or steering the boat like underneath everything. It kind of becomes this undercurrent that's affecting you unconsciously as you move throughout your day and your week and your life. So breastfeeding, though, is this really intimate act that brings you quite face to face with your past, your present, and your future in a very intense way. Like you're staring into the face of your future, right? The sweet little thing that you love so intensely and you want the best for them. And so like insecurities might rise. You don't feel good enough. You don't feel able, all of these things, right? And it can be really painful to face those things. So as a very wise defense mechanism, coping strategy, your brain can shift away from being with that reality that you're facing your future right now and kind of project other things onto it. It's like, oh, if they just, oh, I just hit my microphone. I get so passionate. If they just would stop breastfeeding, then everything would get better, right? You can kind of make your child the source of your discomfort. So that's like the future. But then you also have this present experience of the things that are coming up inside of your body and the discomfort of the moment that you're in right now and the fact that your needs aren't being met. And again, it can just feel like if I could just stop breastfeeding, everything would be better, right? And then there's also this face to face with your past. You're staring into the sweet little vulnerable face of innocence. And that was you at one point too. And that little one, that vulnerable one is still kind of like inside of you. And the experiences that you had when you were quite young are still living in you and with you. And it's easy to just not think about them. But when you're staring into the sweet little face, it can feel a lot like staring into your own sweet little face, right? So it can bring up a lot of things. And that's why it's hard work to work through those pieces. But again, if you don't, they're just going to pop up in other ways for yourself and for your child. But yeah, so you have to identify the needs that are there for your child and for yourself, and then preemptively meet those needs to take the pressure off of breastfeeding. And again, it can be hard to see the needs for what they are because we're doing a lot of projecting to keep ourselves safe because it's a very vulnerable, intimate place to be when you are breastfeeding. So it's much easier to just say, well, if breastfeeding just stopped, then everything would be better. Instead of realizing that there's all of these other things that are going on in your life and they're just showing up in the breastfeeding experience because of how vulnerable and intimate it is. So there's all of these other things that are kind of wreaking havoc, honestly, in your life that will still be there if breastfeeding's not there, but you're not going to be as like open to seeing the pain that they're bringing because that pain kind of comes up in your breastfeeding experience because of how vulnerable and intimate it is. Okay. So, but once you're able to work through that and see that, then you can make those changes, makes the shifts, and breastfeeding just becomes a lot easier in a lot of cases. And a lot of people stop there. They don't need to make any intentional changes to their breastfeeding rhythm. But that is the next step. So if you want to stop there, cool, you've stopped there. If not, let's move on to the next step. And this would be making intentional changes to your breastfeeding rhythm. So this does require a lot of emotional safety for you and for your child because there's going to be some feelings about this, right? So if your child is still using breastfeeding as a method to get their needs met, even after taking the pressure off of breastfeeding to be the primary way that they're meeting their needs, it doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong or bad by making some changes, but it does mean that there could be some pushback from your child. So in order to move through the pushback that might be there, you need to be able to be really open to the moment and to be able to be with them through those feelings because feelings are part of life, right? And you might even have some feelings. You could also have some feelings if your child isn't having any feelings, right? If they don't seem to be having any reaction, they're just like, okay, cool. And they move on. And you're like, no, it's easy for things to come up, right? This is the end. There's grief that can be coming up, all of those pieces. And so having that emotional safety, the ability to see the emotions as safe, the ability to feel safe in the midst of all of those feelings is really key. And that is something that I support parents through very heavily in Own Your Breastfeeding Story. Emotional safety is the number one need that I see goes unmet in the breastfeeding relationship, and that causes the most discomfort. So that's an important one. So I work tons with parents. So then you might just make some intentional changes. That would be step 3. So step 1 is identify the needs. Step 2 is preemptively meet the needs. Step 3 is make intentional changes in your rhythm. And then step 4 would be stopping completely. So basically continuing to make changes until there are no changes left to make. So something to be wary of and aware of if you're moving all the way through to step 4 is that post-weaning depression is a very real thing, and it happens from the hormonal shifts that are happening in your body as you wean. It does not matter how long you have breastfed for or how much you really want to wean. These hormonal shifts can occur and can cause depression symptoms. So your risk does not decrease for post-weaning depression if you really want to wean and if you feel really ready to wean. It can still happen. The slower you go, it tends to cause the hormonal shifts to happen much more gradually, which can decrease your risk, but it can still happen to anyone. So inside of Own Your Breastfeeding Story, I really support parents to have the right support set up ahead of time so that if they experience depression symptoms, which can last for a couple months even after weaning, that they can navigate those and that there's the right supports that they have in place already. Okay, so I know that was a lot. We talked about the five ways to wean, the 5 different categories of weaning: night weaning, day weaning, boundaries, full weaning or stopping, and tandem feeding. And then I talked about what can happen, why the 3 different effects that those methods of weaning can have on your child and on your relationship if you're not seeing breastfeeding as a method of meeting needs, if you're seeing it as a habit to be broken. And then lastly, I went through the 4 different kind of phases of making intentional changes, of supporting your breastfeeding story, the 4 phases of owning your breastfeeding story so that you can avoid those 3 effects, right? The aggression or the kind of like unmet needs popping up in other areas, or the shutting down and detaching from needs in your child. And those were, again, identifying the needs for both you and your child, preemptively meeting those needs to take pressure off of breastfeeding, making intentional changes to your breastfeeding rhythm, and then stopping completely. All right, that is enough for me. This concludes our Gentle Toddler Weaning Series, although it's obviously something I'm going to be talking about in the future. I have some really amazing guests lined up for the next couple of weeks, so I'm really excited to get those episodes out for you. As always, please shoot me a DM if you loved this episode or if you have any questions. I absolutely love talking with you in my DMs. And if you are looking to make some of those shifts, but you're having a hard time communicating with your child about it, you're having a hard time with the actual how of what to do, then make sure to get over and grab my Making Changes PDF guide and cheat sheet for how to say no to the feed while still saying yes to the need. You can get that over at ownyourparentingstory.com/guide. I will see you in the next episode. If you loved this episode, make sure you hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss any episodes in the future. Also, check out my Breastfeeding Toddler Communication Guide and cheat sheet to learn how to say no to the feed while still saying yes to the need at www.ownyourparentingstory.com/guide. And that concludes another episode of Start to Stop Toddler Breastfeeding. The theme song is Little Balloon by Jenny and Tyler, and it has been a pleasure to share this time with you. I'll catch you in the next episode.